Okay, the next item of business is debate on motion 13365 in the name of Douglas Ross on Michael Matheson resignation. I'd invite members wishing to participate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. And I invite Douglas Ross to speak to and move the motion around 11 minutes. Mr Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. We have just witnessed the SNP under John Swinney failing to vote for an amended motion that they drafted. So just to be clear to the public out there, the wording of the motion that has just passed, with every nationalist failing to support it, was the wording that the SNP government asked Parliament to agree to. Now we know independence will be line 1 of the SNP manifesto. It seems incompetence is going to be line 2. SNP MSPs have just said to the public across Scotland that they believe their friend and colleague should receive no sanction at all. Nothing. They didn't put an amendment to say it should be for fewer days or less docking of his salary. They said nothing at all. And up and down the country, people will look at this and wonder why the SNP politicians in here today are supporting their friend over doing the right thing. And I'm struggling to understand the strategy behind this. I can only assume that SNP spin doctors are hoping tomorrow's headline is, "It's a guddle, not a fiddle." But of course it's both. It is a guddle because they've ended up not voting for the wording of a motion that they drafted themselves. And it is a fiddle because Michael Matheson tried to claim £11,000 of taxpayers' money and thought he could get away with it. When he didn't, he lied to cover up his tracks. And when he's been found guilty by the Scottish Parliament corporate body, and when he has been sanctioned by the Standards Committee of this Parliament, SNP MSPs refused to support that. But now the Scottish Parliament has agreed the guilt of John Swinney's disgraced colleague and friend. The question of what happens next is the substance of this debate. And I notice that the First Minister has walked out. He doesn't want to take part in a debate about his colleague who should resign for what he's done. I think that's quite telling. Because the Standards Committee has issued the longest ever suspension given to an MSP at 27 sitting days. Now, they can only operate within the rules of this Parliament. And we've found out time and time again they are out of date. Because while we don't have the opportunity here, the right to recall was introduced at Westminster over a decade ago. But no such opportunity exists here. Now I know some SNP MSPs would like to speak to the Standards Committee about procedures in Westminster, and they would like to use their experience to frame the debate around this. One such MSP is Michael Matheson. He put in his personal statement to the committee, speaking about the House of Commons having an independent nature to look at things, but citing a House of Commons process such as the right to recall, should the committee give consideration to this at a later date, I would be happy to assist in any way, given my experience over the last 5 months. Well, I hope he's also happy to assist the committee with a recall, because my colleague Graham Simpson is bringing forward a non-government bill to introduce a right to recall here in the Scottish Parliament. He has consulted on that bill and it is close to being ready to be introduced in this Parliament. But we do need that because the sanction that has now been agreed by every MSP, apart from those on the SNP benches, it would have led to a recall at Westminster. It is almost 3 times the length of a suspension that requires a recall at Westminster. If you are suspended from the House of Commons for more than 10 days, your constituents locally have the right to say if you are fit to continue in your job. And I strongly believe, as I said earlier, Michael Matheson doesn't need to be just suspended for 27 days. He needs to be sacked. Absolutely. He must leave this Parliament. And even if the SNP MSPs don't agree with that, what is their objection to saying to the people of Falkirk West, judge Michael Matheson, judge his conduct in this scandal, in a by-election. Michael Matheson can be the candidate if, as we've seen today, every SNP MSP supports Michael Matheson to receive no sanction at all, call a by-election and go out and campaign with him. Knock on doors with Michael Matheson in Falkirk West and ask the people of his constituency, do they believe he is trustworthy, he has integrity, and if any of the nationalist MSPs have integrity, surely they would agree with that. But of course, they won't. I will very happily give way to Mr Mason.
John Mason.
Apologies, I didn't press my button. Would the member accept, he compares with Westminster, and I wonder if he would accept that the Westminster process is somewhat more independent and not run by other MPs?
Douglas Ross.
Well, I'm very glad Mr Mason raised that point, because again, I read in the lengthy personal statement from Michael Matheson about his concerns with the process of the corporate body. What I find puzzling is Michael Matheson being so dismissive of the process of the corporate body investigating Michael Matheson. But who was it who referred Michael Matheson to the corporate body for investigation? It was Michael Matheson. So if there is an issue with the system here, then it started with Michael Matheson referring himself to a body that he now thinks didn't look at his claim in as appropriate a way as they could. But of course, we know that the corporate body looked at this in considerable detail. They looked at the facts of the case, and it is an open and shut case. Michael Matheson could see there were issues in his roaming bill. He actually says in his report he feels he was assisting Parliament to claim £3,000 out of his office costs to pay for that bill. His story then repeatedly changed to this Parliament, to the public and to the press. We all remember nationalists lining up to say there's nothing to see here, draw a line under this and move on. He had the support of the former First Minister. He stayed in government for months. And again, the nationalists didn't want to take interventions earlier. One of the questions I would maybe ask the SNP, do they really believe that this has been at no cost to the taxpayer? Because let us not forget that Michael Matheson left government with a payment from the taxpayer of almost £13,000. The original bill that he tried to claim from the taxpayer was £11,000, and because he then resigned the day before the corporate body published their report, he got £13,000 from the taxpayer for resigning in disgrace. But resigning from the Cabinet, resigning from the Scottish Government is not enough. Michael Matheson should do the right thing and resign from this Parliament. And I just cannot understand how MSPs on the SNP benches and indeed the Green benches today, given their amendment, are willing to continue to support someone who has brought this institution, our Parliament, into such disrepute. Now, we know that there is a formal agreement between the SNP and the Greens that has broken down, but we now seem to have the Butte House Agreement 2.0. Because, strangely today, the government are not amending my motion. I'm not sure I can remember a case where the government don't want to amend a motion from the main opposition party on our debating time. They've left it to the Greens. Mr Hepburn, if he wants to intervene, I'm more than happy to give way. I know he's a new Minister for Parliamentary Business, but do the SNP agree with my motion?
Maybe he forgot.
Or maybe he forgot. Do they agree with my motion, and that's why they haven't amended it? Or are they working with the Greens behind the scenes to contrive to vote this down? And I think people can see, not just in this chamber, but across Scotland, that Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater maybe have been kicked out of ministerial office, but the Greens and the SNP are still working closely together. And in this case, it's not for the environment, it's not for the climate, it's not to do good for Scotland, as they often claim they would. It's to protect Michael Matheson. It's to protect someone who lied to this Parliament, who said to the press and the public that there was nothing to see here, but he continued
Mr. Ross,
regardless.
I would remind you and other members in what I'm sure will be quite an emotionally charged debate to be careful with the language that we use. Mr. Ross, please continue.
I'm grateful, Presiding Officer. But the Greens are going to rush to the defence of the SNP again tonight and put forward their amendment, an amendment that in normal times the SNP would have done themselves. But let me conclude my remarks to say that people across Scotland are watching in disbelief. They watched in disbelief last week when John Swinney defended the indefensible. They have watched in disbelief today as SNP MSPs refuse to vote for any sanction at all against Michael Matheson. And now John Swinney is refusing to take action even within the party. He's not even suspended Michael Matheson when in a normal job he would have been sacked by now. But, Presiding Officer, standards in public life matter. The SNP are very quick to accuse others, but they're not so quick when it relates to one of their own. Michael Matheson deserves to be sacked for this scandal. If the SNP and Green MSPs will not vote for that today, if they choose to defend him and defend the indefensible, then it will be up to the voters across Scotland to judge on the 4th of July. And looking at the gloomy faces on the SNP benches today, I think they know what's coming. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, Mr Ross. I now call on Jackie Baillie to speak to and move Amendment 13365.1. Ms Baillie, up to around 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is definitely Groundhog Day. Two debates on the same subject, one after the other. So let me apologise to the Chamber and those listening if I repeat some of the points I made earlier. They do, of course, I believe, bear repetition. Now, I know others will question the motivation of the Conservatives, so let me start by considering that just for a moment. Do I suspect that the Conservatives brought forward this motion calling for Michael Matheson to resign because there is a general election? Yes, I do. Do I suspect it was also prompted by John Swinney's quite extraordinary attempt to defend the indefensible? Yes, I do. Do I suspect that the Tories have noted the recent poll in The Scotsman, where 65% of those surveyed said Michael Matheson should resign? Yes, I do. That said, it is clear that neither John Swinney nor indeed Michael Matheson consider this to be a course of action that they intend to follow. In fact, I saw a television clip of Michael Matheson last week saying that he intended to stay and to stay for many years to come. Can I, of course, gently point out that that will be entirely a matter for the people of Falkirk West, and it is breathtakingly arrogant to suggest otherwise. But this issue has had real cut-through with members of the public. The majority are clear that Michael Matheson should go. A number of people in my own constituency, as you meet them going around your business, have said to me that if they had abused their expenses in this way, they would have been sacked. That is the real world that the majority of people live in contrast to the bubble that is Holyrood. So it's worth recapping on events. Michael Matheson misused a parliamentary device, an iPad, which was taken on holiday to Morocco. He ran up roaming charges of £11,000, which is an eye-watering sum of money. Now, I consider myself to be a hard-working and diligent MSP. My constituents will decide the truth of that, but I would be hard-pushed to spend that kind of money on roaming charges. And I work during my holidays, much to my family's horror and the dismay of my hard-working staff. But let me tell you that Christmas and New Year are the very quietest periods for parliamentarians, as our constituents, quite rightly, have other priorities on their minds. You would be hard-pushed to run up a bill of £1,000, never mind £11,000. Indeed.
Ross.
Grateful to Jackie Baillie for giving way. Does she agree that the data roaming charges in one day, if they were to be believed, were solely used for parliamentary purposes, would require someone to type and send an email every 10 seconds continuously for 24 hours during the Christmas holidays? Could anyone on the SNP benches believe that?
Jackie Baillie.
I will not dispute the information and data given, but what I would say is that is the one time of the year where our constituents actually take a break and decide not to email us. So it is, I struggle to understand how that could be achieved. But as I said earlier, the public might not know this. We all get emails from Parliament staff reminding us when there are changes to broadband providers, several in fact, if we don't respond. We also get emails before recesses asking us if we're going on holiday and where, so that packages can be adjusted. So nobody in this Parliament can say that they didn't know. When the parliamentary authorities raised it with Michael Matheson on at least 4 occasions, he denied there was any problem whatsoever. He had sight of the detailed bill. And to be frank, when this was released to the public, it took Twitter all of 2 minutes to work out that usage was highest when there were football games on. It was obvious. Michael Matheson is not a stupid man. I believe he knew and he said nothing. And the tragic thing is that he has paid a high price for it. His reputation is in tatters, he has had to resign from ministerial office, and he's now been sanctioned by this Parliament. Had he held his hands up, had he apologised and paid back the money straight away, it might have caused a day's uncomfortable headlines, but many of us with children would have absolutely understood. Teenage boys love football, and it's a passion many will share with their fathers. If it had been my daughter, I would have known, but in her case, it would have either been Netflix or the Eras tour of Taylor Swift. You know this about your family. And to be frank, the problem was not the original sin, but the cover-up, the lies and the obfuscation. There was no admission of error, no apology, no contrition. Instead, it has been denial, deflection and dishonesty. And as I said before, the most problematic for me were the questions from Parliament staff about the scale of the iPad bill and Michael Matheson's flat denials. But this pattern of denial, misleading Parliament, misleading the press, and ultimately misleading the people of Scotland, continued right up to the end and showed contempt for all 3. This is a profound error of judgment from someone who should have known better. Michael Matheson has been in the Parliament since 1999. He's been a government minister for much of the SNP's tenure, and I regret that his career is effectively over. Ultimately, it should be for the people of Falkirk West to decide whether they want Michael Matheson to continue to represent them. But their voice is denied because this Parliament has no provision to recall MSPs. The UK Parliament can initiate a recall petition if a member is suspended for 10 days or more. We have seen that used in Scotland with the case of Margaret Ferrier, who travelled whilst COVID infected and recklessly endangered the safety of others. Her constituents recalled her, no thank you, her constituents recalled her, there was a by-election, and the people of Rutherglen and Hamilton West elected Labour's Michael Shanks by a resounding majority. They decided what should happen in those circumstances. So it's right that we should rectify this omission. It's right that we should have the opportunity, or indeed not us, but the people of Falkirk West should have the opportunity to recall their MSP too. Now, I genuinely don't understand the attitude adopted by John Swinney this week. Instead of upholding the highest standards of office, he chose to protect a friend. Instead of upholding the integrity of Parliament, he chose to attack members of the committee. Now, of course, John Swinney does have form in undermining the Parliament and the ability of its committees to do their job. But what utterly poor judgment. This is about John Swinney, as First Minister, putting party before country, defending the indefensible and being out of touch with the people of Scotland. Now, I hate the sleaze and scandal we've seen with the Tory government, but I'm afraid that the behaviour of John Swinney over the past week has been straight out of the Boris Johnson playbook. And if you needed any proof of this, just look at the preceding debate, presiding officer, because I am frankly astonished that the SNP failed to support a motion that they succeeded in amending. They demonstrated by doing that their contempt for the Parliament and, more importantly, the people of Scotland. They've undermined the committee, they've undermined the Parliament, and they've demonstrated yet again that it is always party before country. Now, there is a pattern of behaviour here from the SNP. A party currently under live police investigation. A party that lied to the Sunday Mail over membership numbers. A party that covered up for that their auditors quit.
Ms Bailey,
Presiding officer, I'm coming to a close.
I know. As I indicated to Mr Ross, I think we need to be taking care with the language we use in this debate. I would encourage you to do likewise.
Presiding officer, I would be nothing other than be careful, and everything that I have said is factual. So let me conclude, presiding officer, because I think the people of Scotland do need a right to recall their MSPs, but until that happens, I do think that Michael Matheson should do the decent thing and consider his position. Thank you.
Could you move the amendment?
I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. I now call Patrick Harvey to speak to and move Amendment 13365.2 up to around 7 minutes. Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I move the amendment now in case I forget to do so later. I wasn't really expecting today to be the Scottish Parliament's finest ever day, and I think that expectation is going to be met. I'm in no doubt at all that Michael Matheson's actions have severely damaged trust in our Parliament, and they deserve serious sanction. That's why the Greens made it clear that we would vote for the sanctions that were proposed by the committee and would have voted against any attempt to water down those sanctions had it been proposed. And I suspect that Michael Matheson knows only too well that, as Jackie Baillie said, if he had been honest and upfront about this situation from the outset, made it clear the mistake that he'd made, that he'd repaid the money and that he was sorry, and been upfront about that from day one, I don't think he'd have won many fans, but it would not have resulted in this long-running scandal. His actions were serious, and appropriately, this is the most severe sanction the Scottish Parliament has ever passed. And I do have to say that I think the SNP should have accepted that and should have voted for the sanction. But this debate, this second debate that we're having, now goes so far beyond the sanction that was proposed. The only comparison I can think of, the only time I can recall, presiding officer, that the Parliament has voted for a motion calling for a member to resign was in relation to an MSP who was sentenced to 12 months in prison after being convicted on multiple counts of domestic violence. Michael Matheson's actions were serious. They were not that. And I hope that no one in this Parliament would suggest that they should be regarded in comparison with that level. I do have serious concerns. My party does have serious concerns about the process, because far from being fair and objective, many aspects about how the situation have been handled have been partisan. There is quite clearly agreement that there's been a serious breach of the Code of Conduct, and for that reason we supported the sanction, because the SPPA process is the only one we have, and their proposal for the sanction was the only one that was brought. But we need to be clear that it leaves a lot to be desired. There is no consistency about the severity of sanctions that should be used in different cases. And this is a harsher sanction, significantly so, than even a case of sexual harassment that was dealt with in Session 5. There have been public comments from a committee member before taking evidence who then didn't step back from this process. And I do believe that that opens for the possibility, at least of the appearance of a lack of impartiality. There's been the question about John Swinney's correspondence to committee members not being provided to those members. There is, of course, the leaking of draft recommendations before a last-minute decision to significantly increase the proposed sanction. And that leaves us no way of knowing what the committee would in fact have done if that leak hadn't have happened. Did it affect the final decision that they made? We can't know that. And I'm afraid the convener's reference to the Commissioner is of no real help. Action after the fact in a case like that, we all know is pretty unlikely. What we need is a process that is beyond reproach in the first place. And this isn't the first time. This isn't the first time that MSPs entrusted with a confidential process have acted in this way. At least one member of the Committee on Handling of Harassment Allegations in Session 5 leaked evidence given confidentially by victims. Now, that was a far more serious situation being dealt with than this one, but both those situations go to show that we don't have a process we can properly trust to be impartial and compared with what would take place in another workplace. What kind of process would be capable of that? What kind of process could we have that would not be subject to partisanship? Now, the idea of a power of recall has been proposed again in this debate, and I think that's a worthy thing to bring for discussion. And I do have support for the principle, at least for the most serious cases, for the equivalent of someone in another job at another walk of life losing their job for an offence like gross misconduct. But I have argued in the past that kind of process, for it to be above reproach, it must be conducted and decided independently, not by politicians, and is set out on clearly defined grounds so that it's not susceptible to the kind of shallow partisan politics that we're seeing today. And let's be clear, that's what we are seeing today. The Conservatives have some nerve to pretend that they're acting out of principle today after their leader went election campaigning in Falkirk just days ago. They might at least have maintained the pretence that they're acting out of concern for parliamentary standards, at least until after the vote had taken place. But they couldn't be bothered to do that because they know no one will take them seriously. The idea that a man who served in Boris Johnson's government now presents himself as the standard-bearer of truth and decency in politics, I'm going to treat that with the contempt that it deserves. Presiding Officer, I began by saying that Michael Matheson's actions have severely damaged trust in Parliament, and I think that's right. That's why he's been investigated, that's why the committee proposed a sanction, and that's why I and my colleagues voted for that sanction. I do so without the slightest pleasure. And I worry that far too many people who've been part of this process do see it as a political opportunity for them to milk some advantage during an election period. And I think some of the Tory behaviour that we've seen, particularly in bringing this second motion, does demonstrate that that's what they are here for, and that they seek, rather than to address the damage that's been done to the reputation of Parliament, they seek to exacerbate it.
Thank you, Mr Harvey. I now call Willie Rennie. Around 6 minutes, Mr Rennie.
Yeah, I've been a long-time advocate of recall for members of the Scottish Parliament. It's been a welcome innovation at Westminster, which has both restored some degree of faith amongst voters, whilst changing the relationship between members of Parliament and the parliamentary rules. And it's with regret that the perfect was allowed to become the enemy of the good. When I pressed several years ago for a cross-party consensus in this Parliament for its introduction here, the excuse deployed by party leaders at the time was that the list system meant that power wasn't handed back to the voters but was controlled by the party whips. If we think the list system is undemocratic, then we should change the list system. We should change the voting system. Our list system has always invested power in the parties to order the list in the way that they wish. But to consider that all MSPs should be free from recall just because we don't have a by-election for the list is missing, I believe, a big opportunity for change. Now, today, in the House of Commons, a 10-sitting-day suspension, followed by a petition signed by 10% of the electorate in that seat, would trigger a by-election. The member suspended is entitled to stand in a subsequent by-election. It works. Several members have been subject to the process. It's becoming an established part of our democracy. And I'm sure that this Parliament is capable of developing a system of equal integrity to that is established in Westminster. The 27-day suspension recommended by the Standards Committee for Michael Matheson, that we have only just agreed to, is far in excess of that 10-day threshold that triggers the House of Commons process. If Michael Matheson was a member of the UK Parliament, he would now be subject to a constituency petition. In the absence of a recall mechanism, we will support the motion today calling for a resignation so a by-election can occur. Michael Matheson would be entitled to stand in that by-election. I attended the North Shropshire by-election following the departure of Owen Patterson. Members will recall that Conservative MPs tried to change the rules to benefit him and to save him in his position. It was very much seen as one rule for the Conservatives and another rule for everyone else. They subsequently lost that by-election to the Liberal Democrats. There is a risk that by acting the way that Mr Swinney is over Michael Matheson's case, that he will be seen in a similar way by the voters. I therefore believe it would only be right for Michael Matheson to act voluntarily here, as he would be required to act by law in Westminster. He should step down so that a by-election can be held. If he wishes to stand in that by-election, he would be entitled to do so. If his party, the SNP, wish to adopt him as their official candidate, they would be entitled to do so. And if the voters of Falkirk wish to re-elect him as their MSP, they would be entitled to do so too. Now, I've always found Michael Matheson a pleasant and courteous member of this place. I was especially impressed with the way in which he took over as Justice Secretary from the somewhat turbulent years of Kenny MacAskill. So that it is with some regret that I support the motion today. But I must adhere to the recall policy that I have always supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. We now move to the open debate. I call Graham Simpson, around 5 minutes. Mr Simpson.
Thank you. None of us can say that we've gone through life without making any mistakes. None of us can say that we haven't told the odd porky now and again. We're all human and none of us are perfect, none of us. We will occasionally get things wrong. The test is how you react when that happens. We all live by sets of rules, and as elected representatives, we have our own, which we are expected to and must abide by. We must accept that if we break those rules, there can and should be consequences. Now, I don't know Michael Matheson. I've never had a conversation with him. I don't have a view on what he's like as a person. I do know that he committed a serious error involving a huge bill to the public purse that he tried to wriggle out of it and only stumped up when he was banged to rights. I can also say that there is an arrogance about his response to the inquiry into his behaviour and the suggested punishment that I find distasteful. And I was astonished by the comments from the First Minister last week, but at least common sense has prevailed in this chamber. Now, I've read the reports from the corporate body and the Standards and Procedures Committee. The job of the first was to establish whether Mr Matheson, who asked them to investigate, had breached the rules under which we operate as MSPs, and its findings were crystal clear. Mr Matheson was guilty and had not met the standards of behaviour which people expect us to hold to. It was not their job to decide what should happen to him, if anything. That was the job of the Standards Committee, and that was their only job. It was not their job, as they made clear in their report, to re-investigate. Now, we know what they suggested, and we've just voted on it. That 27-day suspension and 54 days without pay is a record, but it's an extremely serious offence. Now, we've just had a vote. The SNP bizarrely abstained. I was disappointed in the comments from Kate Forbes, but we must move on. And can I briefly turn to the explanation provided by Mr Matheson that his sons watch 2 football matches on their own device and use his iPad as a hotspot to do so. And they knew nothing about it until much, much later. A football fan like Mr Matheson would surely have known his sons were going to watch an Old Firm game and would surely have discussed what they watched with them afterwards. It would actually be a natural thing to have watched it with them. And most people would think that a father and his sons might discuss how they were going to watch key football games before they even went on holiday. If Mr Matheson worked for a private employer and did what he did, he would be out on his ear. He's lucky that he does not. He's also lucky that he doesn't sit in the UK Parliament, because if he did, election aside, he could be facing a recall process. And that, no doubt, would see the end of his political career. Yet he faces no such process here because we don't have one. And that is why he should resign. I believe this legislative deficit needs to be fixed, and that's why I'm bringing forward a members' bill which, if supported, will do just that. And it will tackle the very important issue raised by Willie Rennie about what do we do with regional members. I have a solution for Mr Rennie. Now, when the bill is published, hopefully before the summer recess, I had planned to say that I hoped it would be legislation that would never be used. I do hope that. But as I said at the start, we're all human, and humans make mistakes. So there will be other Michael Mathesons. There will be the Scottish Parliament equivalents of Margaret Ferrier or Peter Bone. Sometime in the future, if Parliament votes to have a recall process, it will be used. Now, I will outline the details of my proposals in the next few weeks. My bill is there to protect the integrity of this place, and I hope those who say they value that will support it. The public will expect nothing less.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. I now call Fulton McGregor to be followed by Craig Hoy. Around. Point of order, Murdo Fraser.
Presiding Officer, can you just clarify for me a point of parliamentary procedure? I understand there's no government amendment to this motion today. Nevertheless, I'd always understood that notwithstanding that, the government would be entitled to have an opening speaker in this debate. I know that you did not call a government speaker in the debate. Can you advise why that was?
Thank you, Mr Fraser. Yes, the Scottish Government has elected not to put forward any representative, and that is not a matter for the Chair. I call Fulton McGregor to be followed by Craig Hoy, up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I say at the start something that's not been mentioned yet? Can we all just remember that we are talking about a colleague here, a man with a family and someone with feelings, and I think it's important that we do reflect that. The motion brought forward by the Conservative Party today was intended to act as a debate on whether Michael Matheson should resign as an MSP or not. However, in reality, what it is served to do is expose a sanctions process that does not retain the confidence of all political parties in this chamber. We are now in a situation where the integrity of the sanctions process has been brought into question. This case has made it apparent that the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee process is open to prejudice, bias and, importantly, political motivation. Surely we can all, I'm going to make some progress, Mr Ross. Surely we can all agree that this is a system that needs to be totally unbiased. As it stands, the parliamentary process we have as MSPs to stand in judgment of each other has been brought into serious question. Let us be clear, Michael Matheson was indeed found in breach of the MSP's Code of Conduct by the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body, not just now, Mr Kerr. Michael Matheson acknowledged the mistakes that he made, and I believe they were genuine mistakes he was not initially aware of, and then paid back the full amount of the data roaming bill. There has been no cost to the public purse. Because of this incident, the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee was granted through standing orders the ability to propose sanctions on the member by a motion to the Parliament. While everyone in the chamber can agree that a sanction is necessary when a member has contravened the Code of Conduct, the process of determining sanctions, how they are developed, are opaque and lack clear guidance. It is within this ambiguity that politically motivated decision-making and bias can arise, and it is due to these biases and motivations that such a disproportionate sanction was brought to Parliament today. Not just now, Mr Kerr. I'm aware there's people want to come in. I will try if I can. Before this case was brought to committee and before any evidence was heard, social media posts by Stephen Kerr and Annie Wells, who are both members of the committee, commented on the issue and questioned the integrity of Mr Matheson. These posts clearly indicated that they had prejudiced opinions. Now, I welcome Stephen Kerr's decision to step down from the committee, citing that it would have been wrong to sit in the committee having previously made public comments on the case. Mr Kerr's decision set out a clear precedent about the conduct Parliament should expect from members who may sit. I am talking about facts in this instance, though. Members who may sit in judgment on cases of this type, and in many ways mirrored the conduct of Chris Bryant MP, who also recused himself recently. The other member, however, did not step down, and after publicly prejudiced the case, then put forward the politically motivated sanction that we have before Parliament today. In addition, not just now. Presiding Officer, there's a way to stop heckling. I have said I'm not taking interventions just now. No, and I'm not taking them just now. In addition to this,
Mr McGregor, could you please resume your seat a second?
Yep.
It is perfectly within the right of members to ask for an intervention, and it is entirely at the discretion of the member speaking whether or not they take that intervention. If I consider that the attempts to make interventions are done in bad faith as a means of disrupting the member on their feet, I will intervene. At this stage, I do not judge that to be the case. Point of order, Stephen Kerr.
Just on that point, it is in good faith if a member mentions another member that they consider taking an intervention. Is that a fair point to make in terms of the order of this chamber?
As I said, Mr Kerr, it's entirely at the discretion of the member who has the floor whether or not they take an intervention. Fulton McGregor, please continue and I can give you the time back.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I accept your judgment on that. In addition to this, details of sanctions and discussions were leaked to the media ahead of the publication of the final decision, and as far as I know, no investigation into the leak has taken place within the committee. The confidence in this system is at a low and reform is needed. There have been sanctions in the past, including one for the member we were discussing here, who was excluded from all meetings of Parliament for leaking an embargoed committee report to the press. But in previous times there have been sanctions imposed. There have been no guidelines on what sanctions should be imposed, with the development of sanctions decided solely by the committee on an ad hoc basis. Not just now. There is no right of appeal, and it is now becoming glaringly obvious that sanctions decided by MSPs can be subject to party political biases. There is too much room for politically motivated decisions when no guidelines exist. I will stress that I am not saying there should be no sanctions, but the sanctions need to be proportionate, transparent and fair. I am not the only person to suggest that the process is open to political interference. In 2008, when the Standards Committee proposed just a one-day ban from Parliament for failing to declare leadership campaign donations as gifts, at that time Jackie Baillie, MSP, said, and I quote, "Wendy Alexander has paid a high price for a report that some commentators have described as partisan. Some members may regard what they have done as a political victory, but wiser heads will reflect on the consequences for the Parliament and for democracy. Let the wiser heads in this Parliament dismiss the report, which is unfair, unjust and frankly plain wrong." End quote. The amendments, I'll take an intervention there, Michael Mara.
Michael Mara.
I greatly appreciate the member giving way. Doesn't it recognise in the case that he states, what actually happened here was that a member who knew that something had gone wrong, that there had been a mistake, and then thoroughly misled both the press and Parliament when he knew fine well what had happened. That is a breach of the standards in public life. It's not comparable to the situation that he regards where people disclosed what had happened. The situation we're looking at here is where there's a clear breach of faith and where the standards of public life were broken.
Fulton McGregor, and give you the time back.
I accept the member's point. He's right to make that point. But the point that I was making is that I'm not the first person to say that this process is open to political bias, because your colleague Jackie Baillie made the same point in 2008, and therefore what I'm saying is what I'm coming to in the two amendments is there might be scope to change that. Now, the amendments brought forward by the Labour and Green parties in today's motion address different areas of concern. I'm happy to look at them in a bit more detail. The Labour amendment seeks to introduce a recall system similar to the one used in Westminster, and this amendment is one that I and my party colleagues are happy to support. However, the system can only be introduced if members have complete confidence in the way it is utilised. If we were to emulate the Westminster recall system, it must also include an independent process which contains a right of appeal, and I know that other members have made that point as well. Likewise, along with party colleagues, I am happy to support the Green Party's amendment, which underlines the need for reform and the current weaknesses in the process and procedures, and the amendment also comments on the disproportionate nature of sanctions and the need for clear guidance on sanctions. And importantly, the amendment stresses the need to have confidence in the system while condemning the committee leaks and prejudicial comments. On that note, I'm happy to take Annie Wells, because I know
Annie Wells, briefly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would just like Fulton McGregor to reflect on what he said, saying that I was suspended from this Parliament for leaking a committee report. I was suspended for commenting on an already leaked report, not leaked by me.
Fulton McGregor, and if you could be winding up now.
Okay, I know the members had the chance to put that on the record, and thank you for their intervention. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, the issue has highlighted the clear need for reform in our sanctions process. Michael Matheson has been a key member of this chamber since the Scottish Parliament was established. He's been a powerful legislator, introducing almost 20 bills to this chamber in his time in government, including the Historical Sexual Offences Pardon Bill, the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Bill, the Management of Offenders Bill, the Vulnerable Witnesses Bill, the Domestic Abuse Bill. The last of these, I remember, being a very emotional day, and there was tears all round. And I mention this because this is an MSP who actually cares about people. And of course, Presiding Officer, these are just some of the examples of good legislation that Michael Matheson has introduced to Parliament. His record also includes voting for progressive policies and voting to mitigate cruel policies of this UK Tory government. Rather than resign, I'd say it's true we actually need more MSPs like Michael Matheson who legislate to stand up for those in our society who need support and protection. What we don't need
Mr Kerr, resume your seat, and Mr McGregor, conclude your remarks.
Who use a privileged position to heap misery on the most marginalised in our society. To sum up, Presiding Officer, I'll be supporting the amendments introduced by Labour and the Green parties this afternoon. The Chamber must have confidence in our sanctions process, and this politically motivated attempt to remove a member by handing out an incredibly disproportionate sanction has highlighted the urgent need for reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr McGregor. I now call Craig Hoy to be followed by Paul O'Kane. Up to 5 minutes, Mr Hoy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm not sure which doors Fulton McGregor is knocking on, but clearly not doors on the same planet that we are all on, because he would understand that the last thing that people are asking for are more politicians like Michael Matheson. Deputy Presiding Officer, the old adage that the cover-up is worse than the crime reverts the fact that attempts to conceal wrongdoing can lead to more severe consequences than the original misdeed. However, in the case of Michael Matheson, both the misdeed and its cynical concealment will rightly shock anyone who believes in public service or justice. Mr Matheson emerges out of the scandal as someone who cynically sought to put his own career and his bank balance before the reputation of this Parliament. Someone who fought to save his own skin when he should have been fighting to save our NHS. Someone who has given repeated opportunities to tell the truth about an improper expenses claim and simply did not. Presiding Officer, the sum of money involved is not just eye-watering, it is also pertinent and it is instructive. It exposes why Michael Matheson may have decided to break the rules of this Parliament and in so doing break the bond of trust that exists between MSPs and the people we serve. Had Mr Matheson returned from Morocco to discover a roaming bill of £11 or £1,100, I suspect he would have just paid it and moved on. But the fact that it was the staggering £11,000 must surely have been a determining factor when he decided to risk his career and his reputation, which now lies in tatters, by loading this cost onto the taxpayer. Now, Mr Matheson still has questions to answer, but I suspect he will dodge them today, just as he has done in the past. But questions still remain for the former First Minister and indeed for the present First Minister. Humza Yousaf stood by his minister, who he described as a man of integrity. Why? Mr Swinney stands by his friend and refuses to sack him. Why? What does Mr Matheson know? What grit is he aware of in the SNP's oyster that he cannot be sacked? And why is John Swinney burning political capital to prop up his pal? These are all very valid questions. But where is Mr Swinney today to answer them? And why is nobody from this government willing to stand at that front bench and account for their actions today? Now, I want to turn to the First Minister's shocking attempt to smear my colleague Annie Wells, a stunt that has spectacularly backfired this afternoon, as chaos rules in this Parliament, with the SNP's motion passing but then the SNP not actually voting for the amended motion. Presiding Officer, Mr Swinney is meant to be the brains of the operation, and if that is so, no wonder many people think that the operation is in serious trouble. In an act of political self-harm that must frankly have astonished even his own colleagues, Mr Swinney has sought to lay the blame elsewhere. Last week he mounted a pathetic rearguard offensive to deflect attention from the fact that he was and is continuing to defend the indefensible. John Swinney cynically sought to focus on process rather than do what every single one of my constituents wants him to do, which is to sack Michael Matheson forthwith. And for the record, I'm proud to have Annie Wells as a friend and as a colleague. I'm proud that she's willing to speak the truth to power. I'm proud that she stood her ground as a member of this Parliament Standards Committee. And I am proud that she did not bend or buckle under the sustained pressure of the SNP's cynical and orchestrated attempt to discredit her reputation. Our constituents are rightly appalled by the actions of Michael Matheson, but they are now equally appalled at John Swinney's mismanagement of the affair. The Scottish Conservatives and the public will welcome the sanction proposed and voted for today, but it's clear that it does not go far enough. It's not good enough that Mr Matheson has been sent home without pay. He should now be sent packing along with his P45. But he still has time. At the 11th hour, Michael Matheson can admit now that the game is up and resign. And if he doesn't, then John Swinney must dismiss him from the SNP. And if the First Minister fails to do so, then in key seats right across Scotland, voters can pass a verdict on Michael Matheson and on John Swinney and on Humza Yousaf and on Nicola Sturgeon and vote Scottish Conservatives to beat the SNP on July the 4th.
Thank you, Mr Hoy. I now call Paul O'Kane to be followed by Stuart McMillan. Mr O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Wisdom, justice, compassion and integrity, those were the values that 25 years ago this Parliament committed itself to and that every parliamentarian must live up to. And they're inscribed, of course, on the mace at the front of the chamber. And Donald Dewar said on the opening day of this Parliament, and I quote, "We will make mistakes, but we will never lose sight of what brought us here, to do right by the people of Scotland." And it is for each of us to reflect on how we do right by those who have sent us here. And to my mind, that means taking responsibility for our actions and responding accordingly. Claiming thousands of pounds from those people who sent us here, and then misleading the press and the public about it, I believe shows no wisdom of judgment. I believe it shows no integrity in holding yourself to account, and it shows a lack of compassion for those who are sitting watching our proceedings aghast at what has taken place here today. And I think that that damages all of us and the very institution of Parliament. The events of the past month, and particularly of the past week, have, I think, shown an utter failure on the part of the SNP, and in particular John Swinney, to do anything to guard against that damage. We have had the unedifying spectacle of the SNP and the First Minister spending weeks and months trying to defend Mr Matheson. Just 1 week ago, rejecting sanctions in an extraordinary performance at FMQs. Then this morning we heard they were performing a U-turn and they were going to back the sanction, and then getting themselves into the situation this afternoon where they sought to abstain. They did not vote on any sanction then at all, and then refused to vote for the motion which they had successfully amended. Unedifying spectacle, I think, is an understatement, Deputy Presiding Officer. And it is, of course, welcome that this sanction has now been applied, but there are still serious questions to answer around the judgment that has been exhibited by the First Minister and SNP members over the last week. Riddled with inaccuracies and reeks of prejudice. Well, that sounds familiar, but those are not John Swinney's words from last week, but rather the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson defending himself as the House of Commons Privileges Committee investigated Tory sleaze, including Partygate. Along with his allies, the former Prime Minister deflected and attacked Harriet Harman for having made public comments and, in his view, politicising the process. Now we have the First Minister, no less, and allies of the former Health Secretary, making similar criticisms about the impartiality of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. And I have to say that some of the language that was used in this chamber this afternoon, particularly in relation to the convener of the committee, was outrageous. It should be a moment when we hang our heads in shame that this sort of behaviour has been imported into this Parliament, watched over by the SNP. Because these have been astonishing misjudgments from someone supposed to be the experienced set of hands and fresh leadership. But perhaps we should not be surprised, because sadly this is not new. And Jackie Bailey, my colleague, has outlined in some detail the record of failure in this regard by the SNP. It is clear that for months and years to come, if Michael Matheson does not do the right thing and resign, this saga will be recorded in the growing list of SNP sleaze incidents. And the SNP act with impunity and a hubris that this will never come back to haunt them. And all the while, faith in our politics and our devolved system slips further and further. And I think that is why, if Michael Matheson will not do the right thing and resign, that's why the Labour amendment is so important. It sets our belief that it is time for this Parliament to have a recall mechanism, to empower our constituents so that they can hold us accountable when we fall short of the expectations that we set ourselves and that they have set for us. We have already seen the introduction of such a system at Westminster, and it was used here in Scotland in the Rutherglen and Hamilton West recall petition and by-election last year. Although I would point out that in the process leading up to that sanction of Margaret Ferrier, it was the SNP MP Alan Dorrans who sought to vote with the Conservatives to reduce her sanction to 9 days to avoid having a recall petition and subsequent by-election in Rutherglen and Hamilton West. So I think that tells you everything you need to know about the SNP's priorities. Party first, country and constituents second. And I think it is clear beyond doubt that this Parliament must have a right of recall. And it will be for Parliament to consider such proposals in the coming weeks and months. But today it is for Michael Matheson to reflect on his own behaviour. I'm sure, and my dealings with Michael Matheson have been that he is a decent man. He must now reflect on what has taken place. He must now reflect on the judgment and the view of this chamber. He must do the decent thing and resign. Or will he cling on? And if he does cling on, and this government continues to defend the indefensible, what is clear is that the public will sit in judgment of this saga and they will have their say very soon. But isn't it clear, Deputy Presiding Officer, that the people of Falkirk West deserve the same chance to decide who represents them in this place, who speaks for their community, and to have that opportunity for a fresh start? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr O'Kane. I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Sue Webber. Mr McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, Michael Matheson himself has indicated that he made mistakes and has been found to have been broken parliamentary rules and has now been sanctioned. It does go to follow that after the process that was in place, that the sanction would have been inevitable. This debate, however, in my opinion, is just sheer political opportunism. It's a debate following on from a sanction against an MSP, which we've just debated, which was undertaken, which we've just debated, which was undertaken based on a process that is flawed and, in my opinion, risks bringing this Parliament into disrepute. The Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee process was open to prejudice, bias and political motivation when it should be totally unbiased. And if we were supporting a constituent with a case where the process was clearly flawed, we would highlight the flaw so that a constituent could get a fair hearing with their issue. In any court process where a jury is to be used, consideration is given to the make-up of the jury so that that jury can be made up of independent people with no link to the case they are about to sit on. The why then? Okay.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. With the best will in the world, if that was the position the SNP was taking, should it not have brought a proposal to amend the sanctions and then vote for the sanction it thought was appropriate, rather than refusing to back any sanction?
Stuart McMillan.
Yes, I think certainly today we had to listen to the debate. Obviously, it's entirely up to others within the government with regards to what amendments or not that are going to be taken forward. But nonetheless, I think we did have to listen to the debate in terms of what was being proposed today. Now, and certainly, Presiding Officer, Why then would this Parliament allow a process where one of the committee members had already prejudged the outcome but still remained on the committee to then vote through on their considerations? What highlights this contradiction is even more as the fact that another member of the committee recused himself for the very same reason. And I do want to congratulate that member for doing so. Now, Stephen Kerr resigned from the committee in March 2024, and he said, and I quote, "I concluded that I couldn't meet the committee requirement to be unbiased towards Michael Matheson and his conduct in public office." And he also went on to say it would have been wrong, having made so many public pronouncements. And he also continued, "And for due process to be observed, I feel I must resign from the committee." Would he give way? Absolutely.
Stephen Kerr.
Just for the record, it's important to state that I, in that same set of quotations, called upon Michael Matheson to resign as a member of this Parliament, because in any other workplace, if you attempted to take £11,000 of expenses that were not due, you would face instant dismissal. And that is all that the motion before this chamber does today. It recognises that this workplace is no different than any other workplace.
Mr McMillan needs to have the chance to respond.
Thank you, President Officer. So I acknowledge the comments that Mr Kerr just made, but I also acknowledge the fact that his comments that I quoted in the chamber were actually comments I suggest actually indicated that he did want to have an independent process in his considerations with regards to this inquiry. But, Presiding Officer, the complete lack of consistency in approaches, in my opinion, is galling and does the committee and also this Parliament absolutely no favours whatsoever. Now, I've had a number of constituents contact me about the situation, some who favour a sanction and some who are very much against. However, when someone contacts me, and somebody did, claiming that the committee was, and I quote, acting like a kangaroo court, I think that says it all. Those are the comments from a constituent of you might not want to hear it, but those are the comments from a constituent of mine. Now, I genuinely don't understand. I genuinely don't understand why the Conservatives actually thought it would be fair and beyond reproach to keep Annie Wells on the committee. Now, the next point of contention is something that every Parliament and committee suffers from, and those are the leaks from private discussions. Now, they've happened before, and sadly will happen again. However, what has been reported last week actually supports the consideration that the committee has acted with prejudice, bias and also political motivation. And despite the committee having just 5 members in there, details of the sanctions and the discussions were leaked to the media, with the Daily Record reporting on Wednesday 22nd, ahead of the final decision on Thursday 23rd, that, and I quote, "The record can reveal suspension will be the sanction, but MSPs were divided on whether it should be for longer than 10 days, and a Holyrood source said there was a view on committee that the optics would be bad if a 10-day plus sanction was applied and Matheson stayed on as an MSP." Now, the final line in the committee report also indicates, and this was referenced today by the committee convener, and I quote, that finally the committee notes the disappointment that material relating to the committee's deliberations appeared in the media prior to the decisions being reached and announced. Now, I'm not sure if any investigations into the leak have been asked for by the committee convener, and I do note the comments from the committee convener in the earlier debate. But what has happened highlights yet again that a fair process was not going to happen. It also begs the question as to why the reported 10 days changed to 27 days overnight. Now, so what changed? Now, a cynic would say that the calling of a general election and seeing an opportunity to push for a by-election on the same day. Now, in my opinion, I do believe it's time for the SPCB to initiate an independent review of the Parliament's complaints process to restore integrity and confidence in the parliamentary procedure. Now, if no review takes place, we are in trouble, and no one will or should have faith in the process again. And members of the Parliament now and in the future need to rely on, to trust and have confidence in the Parliament's processes and also procedures. Presiding Officer,
Mr McMillan, I take it you are concluding.
I am, yes. So the Labour amendment today is something that I've got absolutely no qualms with whatsoever. But it's absolutely crucial that people recognise and realise that in Westminster they have the recall process, but they also have an independent complaints process with the Independent Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. So if we are to have any type of recall, we need to have that independent process before we get to that point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I call Sue Webber to be followed by Marie McNair. Up to 5 minutes, please, Ms Webber.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today, the Scottish Conservatives have brought forward this motion calling on Michael Matheson to resign as an MSP for misusing taxpayers' money and making misleading statements. Surely it should not need the Scottish Conservatives to do this. Michael Matheson should have resigned for misleading the public and Parliament long ago. And frankly, the SNP's subsequent handling of the situation has been appalling. Doubling down, they have put their party before the people of Scotland, and Fulton McGregor appears to be saying the SNP position is, we need more Michael Mathesons. I'll tell you what. In the real world, you would lose your job for what Michael Matheson did. In businesses across the country, large and small, misusing your expenses is a sackable offence. It is black and white in the world outside this parliamentary bubble. Yet First Minister John Swinney has chosen to defend the SNP MSP, his friend. The Scottish Parliament Standards Committee has recommended Michael Matheson be suspended for 27 days and a 54-day salary withdrawal, which we have voted for earlier this afternoon. The penalty should have been and could have been far more severe. Yet despite a cross-party group of MSPs reaching this conclusion, including SNP MSPs, John Swinney has said the investigation into Michael Matheson's 11,000 data roaming scandal has been prejudiced. John Swinney said, and I quote, "Michael Matheson has made mistakes. He resigned and lost his job as a member of the Cabinet, and he paid his roaming costs in question. There was no cost to the public purse. I do not believe that the sanction can be applied." Has he conveniently forgotten that Michael Matheson's claimed £11,000 for roaming charges on a family holiday was reimbursed for? It was agreed with Parliament that the bill would be paid out of the public purse, including £3,000 from his own office costs allowance. That's all taxpayers' money. There was no cost to the public purse, as stated by the First Minister, because several months later, Mr Matheson came clean and eventually paid it back because he was found out. And then last week, I was also stunned to witness John Swinney turn on my colleague Annie Wells during First Minister's questions. Sitting next to Annie on Thursday, I felt the full ferocity of the attack as it was made, all while attempting to portray his friend Michael Matheson as a victim in this whole sorry situation. It was quite something to behold. Let's remember that SNP members on the Standards Committee alongside Annie Wells also felt that Michael Matheson should be sanctioned for this. So this performance by the First Minister was completely unnecessary and uncalled for. And what's more telling is how the public watching FMQs from the gallery that day perceived the entire sorry situation and how out of kilter with public opinion they were. And that came after First Minister's questions with me last week. Because immediately after the session, I popped to the chat room, where we often go after FMQs to meet pupils from our area. And I met with S3 and S6 pupils from Forrester High School. And it is a shame that the First Minister is not here, because I don't have to tell him where that school is, because that's the school he attended. They had just been in at FMQs, and the very first question came from a young lad, and his hand shot up and went, "What's this all about an iPad and £11,000? And when they found out, the chat room erupted. They were absolutely scunnered, stunned, and thought it was outrageous. So my first question would be to the First Minister, if he was able to be in the chamber this afternoon, was does the SNP think it's a good idea to send a message to our young people that it's OK for our politicians to not tell the truth in public office and abuse taxpayers' money? But to be honest, I'm astounded that this sorry saga got to this point, because at the same time as the iPad scandaling was unravelling, this happened to me. In Edinburgh, we have a £2 flat bus fare, or a cat fare if you're hopping off and on all day. That's often the mode of transport I use to get to meetings and surgeries across my constituency. I had submitted an expense claim for a bus fare, and this time I had not provided the information that explained where I got on the bus and then where I got off the bus. I had to redo that claim for a £2 bus fare. Given the rigour and email exchanges that took place for that £2 bus fare, I can only imagine the email exchanges pinging back and forth, justifying an £11,000 roaming bill. And I want briefly to touch on Jackie Bailey's amendment. My colleague Graham Simpson this afternoon has already spoken at length about the process that he's developing for his Members' Bill on establishing processes to achieve that recall. One element of this bill is to consider establishing that system of recall, I'm repeating myself, for MSPs. I'm conscious of the time. In all parties, most parliamentarians go into politics with the intention of serving their constituents dutifully and to the best of their ability. However, in all parties, there are examples where representatives have abused their position or have failed to meet the standards that the public have the right to expect. John Swinney has displayed a staggering lack of political nous by defending the indefensible Michael Matheson from sanctions approved by all members, including SNP members, on the Standards Committee and voted on today. It speaks of fatigue.
Ms Webber, you will need to conclude.
I am. It speaks of fatigue and desperation.
Thank
and
you.
I have no
Ms
doubt
Webber,
it
you're
will
over
stick
the time
in
that
people's
the
minds.
manager asked for. Thank you very much. I call Marie McNair to be followed by Stephen Kerr. Ms McNair.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Michael Matheson made a mistake and has apologised for it. He has rightly paid the roaming charges in full at no cost to the public purse. Even though the investigation has been tainted when it comes to natural justice, what is proposed is one, not just now, I've just started, what is proposed is one of the largest sanctions in the history of this Parliament. Michael Matheson has shown genuine remorse and has taken full responsibility for serious matters that occurred. No person, regardless of position, is inhumane from making mistakes, but I recognise and agree elected members must be held to a very high standard, and I agree Michael Matheson clearly made mistakes. This was a mistake and he has paid the price. It's not a matter to resign as an MSP over. If the price for a mistake is resignation, then Douglas Ross should have resigned a long time ago. But we know that this motion is really... OK.
Douglas Ross.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. Can she explain the SNP position today? They amended the motion to be the wording that they drafted, and then they opposed it. Can she explain to fellow MSPs and the public their thinking behind that?
Marie McNair.
I thank the member for the intervention. I actually thought you were standing up to concede, obviously, your double standards in terms of your £28,000
we need to
scandal.
speak through the chair, please.
Obviously not. Yeah. Apologies, Presiding Officer. The usual attempt to score political points instead of making a serious contribution to this Parliament is Mr Ross, an aggressive, shouty behaviour that Mr Ross should have left in the playground. What is especially evident this time is the breathtaking hypocrisy contained in this contribution, the hypocrisy that surely even he must have been aware of. We remember when Mr Ross reluctantly apologised for the expenses scandal debacle, the £28,000 expenses scandal, and no offer of resignation there, just a grovelling apology. I've taken your intervention, I'm not taking any more. To conclude, there are two choices available to them. Was it a muddle or was it a fiddle? I accepted then that Mr Ross's version that it was just a muddle, but what a muddle it was too. He was quoted in a newspaper article at the time as saying he doesn't know why he failed to declare £28,000 and added the following grovelling apology that it was just a big mistake by me for something I'm deeply sorry, but I know how badly I performed here and how much I've let the people down. And for that, I'm very sorry. I've said I'm not taking any more interventions. So for Mr
Ross, the member's made it clear she's not taking any more interventions.
An apology was good enough, but not now. And this motion is a partisan move. It's not one done out of integrity or any morals. And if it was Douglas Ross, surely they would have more to say on the fact that this Tory party presided over Boris Johnson's Partygate scandal, the PPE scandal, the lobbying scandal, bullying claims about senior members of the Cabinet and the crashing of the economy that's inflicted hardship on so many. And that's just to name a few, Presiding Officer. The Tories are a party of misusing taxpayers' money and making misleading statements, and this is clearly a hypocritical, partisan and self-interested move. If our Tory colleagues cared so much about doing what is right, they surely would have called out those in their own party for all their wrongdoings over the decades in charge. but they don't and never will. If they cared about what was right, they wouldn't be presiding over the two-child policy and its abhorrent rape clause, and they would have acted to ensure WASPy women are fully compensated, and they would not have turned their back
McNair,
on those.
We need to hear from the member who has the floor. That is Ms McNair, and none of the people who are making the noise at the moment. Please continue, Ms McNair.
And I'll repeat, they would have acted to ensure WASPy women were fully compensated, and they would not have turned their back on those impacted by the infected blood scandal for so long. No, the Tory motion here today is not about doing the right thing. It's political point scoring. It's a schoolboy-like attempt at scoring political points, and gut-wrenching hypocrisy just drips out of it. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms McNair. I now call Stephen Kerr to be followed by Alistair Allen. Up to 5 minutes, please, Mr Kerr.
Well, it's astonishing for me to be in the position of being held up by the nationalists as a paragon of parliamentary virtue. But I do take my duties as a parliamentarian very seriously, and I also take my responsibilities to all of my colleagues very seriously too. And the attack on the integrity of my colleague Annie Wells is unwarranted and totally unfair. And I would add, there have been comments directed to the convener of the Standards Committee this afternoon, which are a parliamentary disgrace. Of course, as someone who played a key role in the public disclosure of Michael Matheson's wrongdoing, and then went on to make serial comments about his guilt, it was right that I should stand down from the committee. But the assault on the integrity of Annie Wells is beyond the pale. It's one of the most despicable things that I have heard in this chamber as long as I've been a member of this Parliament. And the First Minister's conduct last Thursday, defending Michael Matheson, is something I believe he will never live down. What we got from John Swinney was all the fake piousness of nationalism. Party first. Always party first. The SNP care only for party. Their own jobs, their own careers, well, there's news. The gravy train is coming to an end for the SNP careerists. And I have to say that the other astonishing thing that has come out of this fiasco is John Swinney's obsession with my social media. He sent 37 pages of my social media posts to the convener of the Standards Committee. He's my most active follower on social media. And it's also become clear that John Swinney would go to any length to defend Michael Matheson. I wonder why. The evidence of the report, prepared by a fair and impartial investigator on behalf of the corporate body, upheld by the members of the corporate body, and the unanimous decision of the Standards Committee, with 2 SNP members on the committee, was that Michael Matheson falsely claimed £11,000. He, and I shall put this politely, deliberately misled the Scottish Parliament, the media, and the people of Falkirk West. He wasn't engaged on parliamentary business in Morocco. The bill was racked up watching football. He didn't try to claim £11,000. He claimed £11,000. He used £11,000 of taxpayers' money for his own personal use. And outside of this chamber, that is called misappropriation. And it was the lowest of low points in this chamber to watch an SNP Cabinet Secretary, Michael Matheson, throw everybody and everything under the bus to save himself. And he was aided and abetted by not one, but 2 SNP First Ministers. Party first, everything else second. And the First Minister chose to scapegoat one of the most conscientious members of this Parliament, my colleague Annie Wells. And John Swinney should be embarrassed, because the reputation of this Parliament is hanging by a thread because of the actions of Michael Matheson and because of the appalling judgment of John Swinney. If we had the appropriate legislation in this place to do as they do at Westminster, Michael Matheson now would be facing the judgment of the people of Falkirk West. But in the absence of that recall, in the absence of the powers of recall, Michael Matheson, if he had a scintilla of integrity left in him, would immediately resign. I worked in business leadership for over 30 years, and I can tell you in no other walk of life would it be acceptable for someone to fraudulently claim expenses and for that person to expect to stay in their employment. They would face instant dismissal. And the people of Scotland know it is only in this Parliament is it possible for someone to do what Michael Matheson did and to feel so entitled to think that they can sit it out without any prospect of dismissal. And I would add, any thought of a police inquiry, because any casual reading of our newspapers tells story after story of employees who do exactly what Michael Matheson did, who have been subject to criminal proceedings. Presiding Officer, the people of Falkirk West can't have their say, but the members of this Parliament can. And if we have any regard whatsoever for this institution, then we must vote this afternoon to call on Michael Matheson to do the decent thing, to resign immediately and to leave public life.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I call Alistair Allen to be followed by Sarah Boyack. Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a recently conscripted member of the Standards, Procedure and Public Appointments Committee, I will not take the bait of some of what the Tories have said in their motion. However, I would like to make 2 or 3 separate and, I dare to hope, useful points. Firstly, I would stand by the view that I expressed in the public session of the Standards Committee last week. The committee did not, and I do not, dispute the need for a sanction in this case. However, I still struggle to see the logical basis for the figure of a 27-day ban on sitting in Parliament, the sanction which 3 of the 5 committee members eventually supported, and how that was arrived at. So whatever your views about this case, it is factual to say that this sanction is exceptionally high compared to any other comparable incident on which the Parliament has imposed a penalty in the past. No, thank you. In any case, while there is a need in many cases for a penalty, including in this case, there also has to be some logical basis for the sanctions that we impose. So I do share the astonishment expressed by a number of members that it is possible for anyone sitting on a committee of this kind to tweet their views extensively about the individual they are about to investigate before they have heard the evidence about him or her. That would never be allowed. The real world has been mentioned a fair bit in this debate. In the real world, that would never be allowed in any industrial tribunal, and if it happened in a jury, it would land someone in serious trouble. I therefore sympathise with the sentiments in the Green Amendment which make this point. And as our committee, no thank you, and as our committee report mentions, it is disappointing, to put it mildly, that the committee's deliberations found themselves in the papers before they were even finalised. Presiding Officer, all of that needs to change. So the bigger picture, the bigger point today, and I appreciate it as a separate but related question to this specific case, is that we have to have a better system in place as a Parliament for the future. As our report indicates, we do have an appetite as a committee to review, or to help to review, some of these issues going forward. Presiding Officer, in the 1st century AD, the Roman satirist Juvenal famously asked, "Quis custodiet ipsos custodies?" or "Who will guard the guards?" In other words, whose job is it to police those whose job it is to police the rules? That has never proved an easy question for anyone to answer, but what can be said is that the answer that we have come up with to that question in Holyrood is open to improvement. In fact, Presiding Officer, it is ripe for reform. Other legislatures do not ask a room full of politicians to reach a non-political view about an allegation against another politician. They certainly don't ask them to do so in the run-up to a national election. Yet our Parliament likes to do exactly that, as Patrick Harvey rightly recalled. Nor do a number of parliaments ask such committees to impose penalties without reference to any clearly understood scale of severity and under rules that are not always clear and do not include a right to appeal. Nor do they ask parliamentary staff to be put in the unfair position in such investigations of writing binding reports in which their own colleagues are mentioned. So, Presiding Officer, for anyone looking in on this today, let me frankly admit there has been a lot more political heat than procedural light in the chamber today. But let me simply conclude by saying this. I believe it is now time for a proper review of how this Parliament deals with allegations against its members. The public have a right to know that such decisions will be reached according to the highest and most objective of standards. We should learn from the example of other legislatures where the investigation is handed over to a person outside both the political sphere and outside the parliamentary staff, with that person's recommendations being put to Parliament or to its committees for a recommended sanction that is based on some kind of a logical scheme. I think that would be a good place to start, Presiding Officer, and it would be an approach the public would expect of us in the future.
Thank you, Dr Allen. And I now call Sarah Boyack. Ms Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Like many MSPs, I have been reflecting on the 25 years of the Scottish Parliament, because I had the privilege of being elected first time in '99, as did the First Minister, and it is a bit disappointing, given the statements he's made over the last few days, that he's not in the chamber to hear the debate we're having. And like Paul O'Kane, I did think back to Donald Dewar's words at the time. That comment he made in his opening speech about we are fallible, we will make mistakes, but we will never lose sight of what brought us here, the striving to do right by the people of Scotland. And I kind of feel the tone of today's debate. We have lost sight of what brought us here, because it is okay to be fallible, to make mistakes, but we're not just talking about a simple mistake. Today we're holding to account a member of this Parliament who attempted to use taxpayer money for personal gain, then misled others about it, breaking the code of conduct that we are all bound by. So I think on reflection, we've got to make sure that ensuring parliamentary standards are upheld and that those who ignore those standards are held to account. So I think it's absolutely vital that Parliament demonstrates that we're all still striving to do the right by the people of Scotland. And I thought her first speech, Jackie Baillie, was very measured in highlighting the importance of the need for us to take the right decision today. Because I do feel that in mishandling this episode, the Scottish National Party and the First Minister have jeopardised potentially the integrity of Parliament at a time when we know that trust in politicians is plummeting. And I think people are getting tired of a government that's putting self-interest before the national interest. And they're tired of the bullying accusations, COVID rule breaking, WhatsApp deleting. This just adds to that kind of narrative. Now, by his refusal to acknowledge the findings of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, the First Minister has undermined the vital structures that make this Parliament work, because accountability is an essential component of a democracy, and the Standards Committee is one of the most important ways by which we all are in this chamber accountable. You've also got the Scottish Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, which we set up in 2002. There are ways in which people can complain about us, and we all have to go through the process. And if we disregard the committee when it doesn't suit us or goes against our party, we do actually potentially throw the work of our Parliament into disrepute. So I do question the fact that members in the previous debate amended the motion and then didn't vote for us. Because, to be clear, the committee were unanimous that Michael Matheson should face sanctions, and they agreed on the need for a financial sanction for 54 days. What, as Alistair Allen commented on, there wasn't agreement on what the time he shouldn't be allowed to come back to Parliament was, but that was a discussion of the committee, and there's an extent to which we have to respect the work of that committee. And at the end of the day, I cannot be the only MSP who's regularly told on the doorstep that politicians are only in it for themselves. It's something we all have to address. One of my constituents also observed that if they'd done what Michael Matheson did, they would have automatically lost their job. I probably wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't comment that it's a bit of an irony that it's a Tory debate today, rightly criticising Michael Matheson's actions, given the previous actions of their colleague and former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, when he broke the ministerial code on numerous occasions. But this is politics. We are all going to disagree with each other, but fundamentally, since our Parliament was established, we need to make sure our constituents have confidence in the Parliament. That doesn't mean that people won't make mistakes, but we are accountable, and they need to know that we reflect on the changes that's been made. So a couple of years ago, we published our proposals in a Stronger Scotland document, and that's where we suggested as Scottish Labour that we should have the right of recall and other measures to improve the operation of our Parliament. The right of recall was introduced in the UK Parliament in 2015. I think when we were first established, we were best practice. There's something about looking at the experiences of our work over that 25 years and involve everyone in that process. I think the points that Jackie Bailey made in her amendment, in her speech today, would ensure that in certain circumstances of misconduct, voters would have the opportunity to remove MSPs. It is an obvious step to strengthen our democracy and restore the electorate's trust. They need to know that we're here to serve them and we're accountable. Now, I totally get, after last year's result in Rutherglen and Hamilton West, why the SNP might not be in a hurry to introduce the right of recall, but it is the most democratic way of returning to the ideals outlined by Donald Dewar, that parliamentarians are here to serve the people of Scotland, and we should always be striving to do what's right. It's not too late for Michael Matheson to do what's right. We need change, and we need it now. It really can't come soon enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Boyack. And we will now move to closing speeches, and I call on Patrick Harvey. Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think the one line that will stick in my mind from this debate more than any was when Douglas Ross made a reference to Donald Trump before then accusing somebody else of bully boy behaviour, because I think all of us recognise that one of Donald Trump's standard tactics is to accuse an enemy of his own worst traits. I voted for the sanction against Michael Matheson because I care about the reputation of this Parliament. Michael Matheson's actions damaged it. Approving a sanction is a necessary step to attempting to restore Parliament's reputation. But I'm really very worried at the moment, after the debate that we've just had, about the period that we're going to be moving into, because I think most people can recall at the tail end of the last session of the Scottish Parliament, a period of minority government, where the Conservative Party in particular gleefully leapt on every opportunity to drag the name and the reputation of this Parliament down to their own level. And I fear that they're about to do the same again. And they have been doing the same again in today's debate. We have seen shallow partisanship throughout all of this. We have also, I'm sorry to say, seen a lack of judgment from the SNP, who should have fairly expressed the reasonable and valid concerns that they have and that I share about the process that's taken place, but then should clearly have backed the sanctions against Michael Matheson. And if they didn't believe that was the appropriate sanction, they should have proposed an alternative, even if that meant losing a vote, and vote for what they genuinely believed was the appropriate sanction. As for this, I'll give way briefly, yeah.
Bob Doris.
Whether Patrick Harvey would consider, I've previously sat on the Standards Committee. If you're not actually on the committee and you're not having those discussions in private, it's quite difficult to work out what an alternative sanction would look like, and it is possible to have concerns over process, except there should be a sanction, and then by abstaining, not standing in the way of the sanction that the committee did actually take forward.
Patrick Harvey.
Which is precisely why, though I share many of the concerns about the process, I voted for the SPPA proposal for the sanction, because it is what is on the table. So I take the point, but the one thing everybody seems to be agreed on is that Michael Matheson, his behaviour was deeply far short of the standards expected of MSPs and should be sanctioned. It's now been given a severe sanction. But I want to repeat the comparison that I made in the opening speech about the motion here in this second debate. As far as I can recall, the only member who's ever been subject to a vote of Parliament calling for their resignation is someone who was sentenced to 12 months in prison after conviction for multiple acts of domestic violence. Am I wrong? Is my memory failing me on this? Has this happened in any other case? Or is anyone seriously suggesting that what Michael Matheson did is anywhere near as serious a grave crime as that? I don't think so. I'll take one more intervention.
Edward Mountain.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to talk about other people's crimes, but let's be honest, 40 years of employment law has taught me that if an employee steals from his employer, they are considered to have created gross misconduct. Indeed, in fact, borrowing money overnight and subsequently repaying it is also gross misconduct. Gross misconduct gets you fired. Why should we not be discussing that in this case? Because everyone else in Scotland is.
Patrick Harvie.
And I'm going to come on to relevant points there. I don't think that this motion adds anything at all by trying to treat Michael Matheson's case in a way that is comparable to that of Bill Walker. I don't think that's appropriate, and I don't think it's what Parliament should vote for. So the motion adds nothing. Jackie Bailey's amendment does add something with serious substance, and it deserves to be discussed. There is a legitimate argument in favour of a recall process, and I'm open to that principle. I support that principle. My party supports that principle. Let's have a debate about it. And I think that a system could be found that works and that isn't susceptible to political partisanship. But I think it's inappropriate to try and retrofit that onto an individual case in this way. And I wouldn't support the version of a process which is decided by politicians rather than an independent process. In Session 5, I was a member of the SPPA committee that considered some of these issues, and I supported the idea of a recall process or something comparable to a person losing their job for gross misconduct. But it has to be for the most extreme cases. It has to be done in a way that is impartial rather than being subject to political decision-making. It has to be one that carries cross-party support. And Jackie Bailey, in fact, acknowledged in her speech the political motivations, including electioneering, in some of today's debate. Simply deciding in a debate like today's to copy the Westminster system, that's not something that I can support. Even Paul O'Kane's speech also demonstrated that the Westminster system itself is susceptible to political motivations. Everyone will offer their own version of what we should do in this. If Graham Simpson wants to bring his bill, he'll do so, and we should debate it. If he wants it debated in a fair and balanced and reasonable way, I do urge him, seriously, not to go back to his previous habit of proposing it in a way that personalises the issue with the name of a political opponent, because we all know that we could pick names of any political party and find a way to personalise the issue in that way. So I hope he'll resist the temptation. If I have any more time.
Briefly, Mr Simpson.
I agree with Patrick Harvie on that, and I am desisting from following that approach. And I would just urge Mr Harvie to discuss my proposals when he sees them.
Patrick Harvie.
I'm glad that he's going to desist from that. That would be helpful. Presiding Officer, in closing, I'm pleased that Parliament has already voted today in favour of asking the SPCB to conduct a review, an independent review of the process. I hope that they will heed the words of Gillian Mackay earlier today in recognising that harm to people is the most serious form of offence that an MSP can commit, and it should be the one that is subject to the most serious sanction. Not only the example of sexual harassment that I gave earlier, Jackie Bailey, in fact, mentioned the case of Margaret Ferrier, whose actions directly put other people's lives at risk. Harm to people is surely a more serious form of offence for any MSP and should be treated more seriously. And what I hope comes from this independent review is a system that needs impartiality not being susceptible to political and politically motivated decision-making. Needs consistency and needs decisions that are made on the basis of evidence and with the right of appeal, because those are the kind of things that would be available to people in what has been regularly called in this debate the real world. Those are the principles that we should have in any system of standards and sanctions in this Parliament.
Thank you, Mr Harvey. I now call on Michael Mara. Mr Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The debate today, at times, I think you could begin to imagine that this was a complicated issue. And it's very far from it. It's a very simple matter. A man earning £126,000 a year wrongly claimed £11,000 on his expenses from his employer. Then he was caught. So he misled Parliament, he misled the press, and ultimately he misled the public. It is a simple matter. 65% of the public believe that Michael Matheson should resign, because they know that 99% of the people that they work with would have been sacked for exactly the same offence. And yet the SNP do not support any punishment whatsoever. None at all. Party before country every single time. And what we have seen from the fresh leadership of the First Minister in the last week has been incredible, it's been inexplicable, and it has been incompetent. I would ask you to spare a thought for his MP colleagues who are facing the voters over the coming weeks. And of course, it's been quite easy to read their thoughts about the First Minister widely and in graphic detail in the press. Because this is no fresh leadership, really. It's the same John Swinney, who was once for 2 days the most popular politician in Scotland. The Parliament's process produced an answer that he did not agree with. So he denigrated those involved. He sought to undermine the procedures. He sought to cast doubt on the ability of this place to deal with the wrongdoing of an arrogant SNP government that believes it is above and should be above reproach. Police investigations, repeated briefings to the press of matters of blatant factual inaccuracy, cover-ups as a culture, WhatsApps deleted on industrial scale, egregious conduct during the Salmond inquiry, where evidence was withheld and incidents and John Swinney was right at the heart of it all. I have to say that the amendment from Scottish Labour is the right means to deal with that egregious misconduct. And it is right that Parliament's democratic view is taken on that. Jackie Bailey highlighted Rutherglen and the actions of Margaret Ferrier, which resulted rightly in the recall petition and the defeat of the SNP in that by-election. And I think it's possible to draw that lesson more widely, because although there have been few recall petitions, they have triggered resignations, the reality of the prospect of a recall. And that's led to a slew of by-elections across England, where the venal corruption and grotesque misconduct of so much of the Tory party has whittled this dying government down to the chaff. So recall can help to rebuild the faith in politics in Scotland that's been washed away by two governments that care very little about the public. And I have to say congratulations to Jamie Hepburn today on what is an extraordinary whipping operation, when the free-thinking evaluation of this case brought the SNP to the universal position of an entirely illogical contortion. And then he decided, as a result of that, not to stand and defend it, but to ask the backbenchers to do the job instead. And that was the contradictions of that case was fully set out by Paul O'Kane. And he was right to show how this mirrored the conduct of Boris Johnson when he questioned Parliament's right to hold him to account for his actions. And the language used of the kangaroo court was repeated again by Mr Macmillan from the backbenches. So this may be an uncomfortable comparison for John Swinney, but it's one based on fact and what is, again, a very simple matter. Any man or woman who acted in the way Michael Matheson did would have lost their job. He should lose his. The SNP believe there should be no punishment whatsoever.
Thank you, Mr Mara. And I now call on Murdo Fraser to wind up. Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In essence, this debate is about two interconnected issues. The question of integrity and the question of respect for this Parliament and its procedures. And it tells us, I think, all we need to know. That not a single minister in this government was prepared to speak up for their former colleague, leaving it to their backbenchers to make the case throughout this debate. We've had 3 ministers on the front bench throughout this entire debate. Not one of them has said a word. I'm happy to give way now to any of them who want to contribute to this debate and give us the government's position on where matters stand. No, Presiding Officer, they are embarrassed, and they are right to be embarrassed, because Michael Matheson acted indefensibly. He claimed £11,000 of taxpayers' money in data roaming fees incorrectly. He misled Parliament and he misled the Presiding Officer. I'll give way to Mr Finlay.
Russell Finlay.
Thank you for giving way. John Swinney last week said there has been no cost to the public purse, but this has been going on for over a year, taking up huge amounts of parliamentary time and resources. Surely that lie should not be repeated any further.
I would, as has been mentioned a few times this afternoon, caution members on the language that they use in this chamber, cognisant of the standards that we are all subject to. Murdo Fraser.
I thank Mr Finlay for that intervention. I can only agree with his sentiments. Now, each one of us here knows how the expenses system in this place works. When we incur a cost, we all have to sign a declaration saying that expenses were properly incurred on parliamentary or on constituency business. Michael Matheson must have made that declaration. Indeed, we know he did. He did so fraudulently. The most generous interpretation that can be put upon his behaviour is that he did not know when he signed that declaration how the roaming costs were incurred. But he either knew this was not a legitimate parliamentary expense, or he should have made appropriate inquiry. He did not, and he induced the parliamentary authorities to pay £11,000 of taxpayers' money that should not have been paid, refunding him costs that should have come out of his own pocket. Better lawyers than I, Presiding Officer, have already argued this sequence of events amounts to a fraud on the public purse. That is a matter for the police, not for this Parliament, but illustrates the seriousness of the matter we are dealing with, and why nothing less than Michael Matheson's resignation from this Parliament is appropriate as an outcome. Now, we heard earlier from the Deputy First Minister in her defence that the money was repaid, as if that was some sort of excuse for Mr Matheson's behaviour. Yes, the money was repaid. It was only repaid after the matter was publicly exposed. And of course, a thief who returns the stolen goods does not escape punishment in law. Now this Parliament has agreed an unprecedented 27-day suspension and a 54-day loss of earnings. Although astonishingly, the SNP in this place did not support any sanction against Mr Matheson. They could have amended the motion before us this afternoon with an alternative sanction. They chose not to do it. They regarded him as somebody who should get off scot-free. And that will now be the end of the matter for Mr Matheson, as matters currently stand. Had he been a Westminster MP, as we've heard during this debate, he would potentially be facing a recall petition. And I would not give much for his chances of re-election in a by-election in those circumstances. But we have no such mechanism here. Graham Simpson, who we heard from in the debate earlier, is bringing forward a members' bill to bring a right of recall to this Parliament. But that is still at an early stage. If Michael Matheson were an honourable man, he would do the right thing and step down at this stage. And as Willie Rennie said, he can always contest any subsequent by-election and seek the confidence of his constituents for re-election. I have no personal animus against Michael Matheson. When he was a minister, I worked cooperatively with him on a number of issues, including bringing forward amendments to the transport bill to address the issue of private parking. I always found him congenial and helpful to deal with. But in acting the way he did on this matter, he has brought this Parliament into disrepute, and he needs to bear the consequences for that. And the point has already been made that in any other workplace, Michael Matheson would have been sacked long ago for his actions. It is inconceivable that in any private sector organisation, or for that matter, in much of the public sector, anyone making a false claim for expenses of £11,000 would still be in a job. And this Parliament should not hold itself to a lesser standard than that which applies to those who pay our wages. For those reasons, Michael Matheson should be resigning. And, Presiding Officer, none of what has happened over the past few weeks reflects well either on the previous First Minister, Hamza Yousaf, or on the current one, John Swinney. John Swinney's response to the decision of the Standards Committee to sanction Michael Matheson was not to support that, not to recognise that Matheson deserved punishment, but rather to launch a disgraceful attack on my colleague Annie Wells. And this has led, as we know, to the social media abuse of a female member of this Parliament in totally unacceptable fashion. In the 27 pages of evidence submitted by John Swinney to the Standards Committee, there was just one reference to a social media post by Annie Wells. She was expressing an opinion on Michael Matheson's wrongdoing, as she was quite entitled to do so. As our well-respected former colleague Andy Whiteman of the Scottish Greens said on Radio Scotland this morning, everyone and his dog had an opinion on Michael Matheson when the news broke about this scandal last year. Politicians are asked for their opinions on matters in the news and freely express them. And the idea that expressing an opinion, as Annie Wells did, meant her role in the committee was inappropriate is simply grasping at straws from a desperate First Minister determined to undermine the integrity of this Parliament in order to protect a political colleague he described as a friend. In any event, Annie Wells's comment was on the question of the guilt of Michael Matheson, not what the appropriate sanctions should be. And, Presiding Officer, the guilt of Michael Matheson has never been in doubt. It was accepted by this Parliament's corporate body even before the issue came to the Standards Committee. What Annie Wells did was adjudicate on the punishment, not the question of guilt, and she should not be criticised for that. And, Presiding Officer, had there been concerns about Annie Wells' behaviour, that was properly a matter for the committee convener, not for the First Minister. We always hear from the First Minister and others about the need to show respect for this Parliament. But here we have the First Minister showing contempt for this Parliament and its institutions. The SNP always like to claim some sort of moral superiority over Westminster. This whole episode has exposed the fact that they are prepared to engage in tawdry politicking and undermine this Parliament when it suits them in order to defend one of their own. Presiding Officer, I was in this Parliament in 2008 when SNP members of the Standards Committee insisted on an inappropriate and unduly harsh punishment on the former Labour leader Wendy Alexander for what was a technical infringement of the rules in declaring interests at that time. Who voted for that punishment at that time? John Swinney did, Nicola Sturgeon did, and yes, Michael Matheson did. They didn't complain about the process then, Presiding Officer. They didn't demand a review of the process, but now when it's one of theirs in the firing line, they take a different stance. It's the most egregious of double standards. Presiding Officer, I will leave the last word on this to Andy Whiteman, who said last week, in response to comments from Michael Matheson complaining about the process, he said this: straight out of the Nicola Sturgeon playbook, smear committee members, undermine and discredit a parliamentary committee, all to save your own career, Scottish Parliament standards now being hugely undermined. Presiding Officer, that is why Michael Matheson should go, and that is why we should support the motion this afternoon.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on Michael Matheson resignation. It's now time to move on to point of order, Emma Harper.
Presiding Officer, I wish to make a point of order under Rule 7.3 of the Scottish Parliament Standing Orders, which relates to the conduct of members in chamber, and in particular the need for members to follow the direction of the presiding officer. Today, during this debate, which I've sat through this afternoon, we heard the Conservative member Craig Hoy state that in key seats across Scotland, voters can pass a clear judgment on Michael Matheson and John Swinney and vote to get rid of the SNP on July the 4th. This is in direct contradiction to the statement made by the presiding officer on Thursday, the 23rd of June, where she made it clear that, and I quote, "I again remind members that the chamber is not the place to be electioneering, and I do not want campaigning to distract members from focusing on matters for which the government has general responsibility. So can I therefore seek the presiding officer's guidance on whether Mr Hoy's comments are in line with her direction, and if not, what
Can we
steps
please hear
can
the
be
member?
taken?" And presiding officer, I know they're no interested, but you're presiding over this chamber is absolutely paramount and really important to me. So I know it's maybe not important to the members on the left side of me. So I seek your guidance as to what the response would be. Thank you.
Thank Ms Harper for a point of order. I have made my views on electioneering in the chamber very clear, and I would also say that the presiding officer in the chair at any time is usually best placed to rule on such matters. We've concluded the debate on Michael Matheson's resignation, and it's now time to move on to the next item